The good old clap, take one.
That's right.
How many of you knew what you wanted to be when you were 7 years old? I did. I wanted to be world champion.
Hey, is there honesty involved in this podcast? Can we be honest?
You can shut your fucking lips.
And then I'll just say, put them up, what? Let's go.
He's like, you look too pretty on the wave. Get ugly.
We can talk about DMT if you want.
I thought we were boxing.
All right. We have none other than celebrated storyteller Stacy Peralta and Mr. Pipeline himself, Gerry Lopez, on the lineup today. Gentlemen, it is a true honor, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we get into today's conversation, I always like to do a little bit of a scene setting. So, how are you both doing? Where are you at right now for our current conversation? Gerry, why don't we start with you? Where are you at today?
I'm in Bend, Oregon, getting ready to leave for Japan tomorrow.
Oh, very cool. Well, we appreciate you fitting us into your schedule. And Stacy, where are you at today?
I'm at my house in California on the coast, doing this with you guys.
Well, we are here to discuss your upcoming film project, The Yin and Yang of Gerry Lopez, which premieres on September 22nd, and listeners will be able to stream it on patagonia.com/Gerry. I've been fortunate enough to see it a couple of times. It is incredible. So congratulations to you both. Stacy, I want to start with you. Given your background, first as a professional skater, then a businessman, then a filmmaker known for many things, including the documentaries Dogtown and Z-Boys, Riding Giants, and Crips and Blood Made in America, it seems like your particular storytelling palette gravitates towards largely niche subcultures, which I'd imagine can be really challenging to extract like singular stories out of. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, why do you think you're attracted to telling those kinds of stories?
I didn't fit very well in Hollywood. I don't think I'm very representable. I had agents briefly, very, very briefly, but they didn't know what to do with me. And so it just seems that I work better on the periphery. I don't know, it appears that I work better outside of that venue. And outside of that venue, you get different projects, which are similar to the projects that I do. That's just the way it's unfolded. That's the way my path is unfolded.
That makes a lot of sense. And Gerry, I can't imagine that Stacy is the very first person that approached you about doing a documentary on your life. Can you talk us through your relationship with him and how you decided to do this project?
Well, it was a long process. And Stacy and I had talked about this a long time ago. And in this process of trying to put it together, at first it was Jack McCoy and I. We kind of came to a wall where we didn't know what to do, how to make this film. And I said, okay, we got to see if we can get Stacy interested, because if anybody knows how to make it, he will. And that was another long process too, wasn't it, Stacy? We've been talking about this for a long time. And when we finally got to a point where we kind of agreed and decided that, yeah, maybe let's, get serious about doing this, then that was the start of another long process. And anyway, it took a while. And in that process, I realized that I, if Stacy wasn't going to be involved, then I wasn't going to do it. And I always felt that he was the only guy that could have done this film.
Well, it was about 6 years ago. Gerry and Jack called me, and they thought they were close to landing a financier, and the financier was wavering. And so they called me and said, hey, we feel if you would lend your name to this, maybe we could get this guy to sign, the check and we could get on with it. So a really good friend of ours, John McMahon, owns a house in the Hollister Ranch. We all met there with this proposed financier. Well, it turns out this guy actually didn't have money. He was the kind of guy that would find the money. So it was just one more step in a mess, okay? Well, by that time, Gerry and Jack kind of hooked me in, and I said, look, I don't want to make the film. I didn't want to get involved in a film at that time, and Jack really wanted to direct the film anyways. And I said, but I'll dedicate as much of my time as I can to help you guys find financing. So I spent a year trying to help them get this film financed, and we couldn't get it financed. And so finally, after I think maybe a year or two, there just weren't any sources left. And so the film, like many of these projects, it just stopped. It just kind of like, it was put on the shelf. And then about 2 years later, Patagonia called. Now, Patagonia has a really tight relationship with Gerry. They make environmental films, but they decided they wanted to do something that was outside of their comfort zone. And so they decided to make this film about Gerry because they already had a great relationship with him. He deserved a film because of the life he's lived. And they thought, let's try something different. And so they came to me and said, look, we're just considering 2 people. You're our first choice. And we know Gerry would like you. And so would you consider this? And that's kind of how it happened. And so when they stepped into it, that was the first time we were guaranteed a budget. This is not going to fall through. And that's how it happened. And that was, I don't know, that was about 8 months before COVID, a year before COVID, maybe. And we all decided, okay, let's do this. And so we went back to Jack and said, look, Jack, we know you had wanted to do this, but it's, this whole thing has changed hands. And so we made sure to give Jack a position on the film out of respect for what he had done. I just want to share one thing. It's a funny anecdote. We have it was a small budget. So we had to bring all of our interview subjects to us in one place. And we built a set of a shaping room on the Patagonia campus. The week we were there shooting all the interviews, we did 7 days of interviews all day long, interview after interview. Yvonne and his wife showed up and they watched a number of the interviews over a couple of days, Yvonne Chenard being the owner of Patagonia. Well, after that week, and it was a really great vibe. Everyone had a great time. It was really, really cool. Like people like Sean Thompson, Barry Kanayapuni, Tom Carroll. It was a really special place, okay? Well, after that week, Chenard went back to his company and said, why are we making this film? This is not an environmental film. And so Patagonia came to me and said, hey, you got to come up with a reason why we're making this film and go explain it to our CEO. And I said, hey, I didn't choose to make this. You guys did. And they said, yeah, but you're the director. You have to explain to them. So I had to do some very serious thinking about why they are making this film because they're an environmental company. But it really made me realize something. And it was a good thing that it happened because it is an environmental film after all, because it's about the inner environment of Gerry Lopez and how he has tended his environment beautifully his entire life. Granted, it's not about the exterior environment. It's not about mountains in the ocean, although they're in it. But it's really about a human being tending to his own inner environment and keeping that environment clean, healthy, and strong, and vibrant, and vigorous over an entire lifetime. So I pitched that to the Patagonia crew, and they said, you know what? That's acceptable. That works. And that helped us understand our film better because when you watch this, it's really about a guy who has been devoted to self-development his entire life, which is, Gerry's life.
I think that makes a very strong case. Now, it's funny you bring that week up because I was going to say prior that I've been at the ASPWSL for 17 years now, and I've had the benefit of working alongside, Judge Davey Shipley, who's Jack Shipley's son. And this is a few years ago that Davey reached out and he said, oh, I'm in town. I'm in Ventura. And Dad's filming these interviews for this project. And we caught up, we had dinner, and I was really excited about it then. I'm much more excited about it now, but it doesn't sound like making documentaries is a quick process in general, but Stacy, I'm wondering how this one compares with some of the other ones you've made in terms of how long it's taken and just like time and effort.
They're not easy because you don't get a lot of money to make them, so you have to beg, borrow, and steal a lot. You have to make a lot of compromises, which make it difficult. I also don't make a living doing this, so I have to work on the side to make a living while I do this. So it's a challenge in that regard. But the most challenging part of making this film was Gerry's life's just too damn broad. There's too many chapters to it. I mean,
Mm.
he was a movie star briefly. He has the entire G-Land, Indonesia experience, which are totally different than the pipeline experience and the Ala Moana experience. And then he's a 50-year shaper, and he's also a 50-year yogi. He has so many cross currents, yet that was hard, is how to sequence his life. And that was difficult for us. The editing process in this film was very tricky. We also got hit with COVID, which split everybody into their own kind of homes, which also delayed the process. And there was moments where we weren't even sure the film was ever going to see the light of day. It was very challenging. So,
Hmm.
but really, the challenge of this film was Gerry's life is large, and it was how to tell it in a way that's compelling.
Yeah, and for as expansive as Gerry's life is, when people see the film, like the way you were able to thread that narrative, it's still so potent, and even though it's very, very dimensional, and Gerry, there are, as we've talked about, there's no shortage of talking heads in this project, but the caliber of contributors in this film are really a testament to the impact you've made on surfing as a whole. We've mentioned some of them, but Sean and Michael Thompson, Randy Rarick, the ever reclusive Gordon Grubby Clark, Steve Pesman, Jack McCoy, Bill Boyum, the list goes on and on and on.
Barry Kanaiapuni.
Barry Kanaiapuni, yeah, of course. But Gerry, as you were working through that filmmaking process with Stacy, how much did you personally have to do with identifying the people to include to round out your story? And then did you have any concerns over what they may say? I can imagine that making this film is a pretty vulnerable process.
In the very beginning, Stacy said, "You got to tell me everything." And I went, "Everything?" And he said, "Everything." And I went, "You mean all the sordid details too?" He said, "Everything." And, it was just another surrender in a great many surrenders in my life that is kind of cleansing in a way. And, you can't ever control what people say about you, but most of these people, in fact, all of them are my friends, and still are. And some of the interviews were just highly entertaining. I mean, Rory was, as Stacy put it, a runaway train. They turned the camera on. Stacy is probably, I've been interviewed, I don't know, thousands of times in my life, and no one does an interview better than Stacy does. And watching him, not only, when he's interviewing me, but interviewing everybody else, it's like, I don't know, watching Rembrandt paint one of his pictures. And it was, with Rory, like Stacy said, there was like little control. Maybe it was more like a Jackson Pollock kind of painting, but it was really a fun process. And, Stacy mentioned Yvonne and Melinda coming and sitting on the sidelines and watching a lot of these interviews. And I think they were highly entertained too. And
yeah,
it was really kind of a real learning process for me too, about myself, that, some of the things I heard, I just went, ooh, but those are mostly, from my family. And it was all good, and the only regret I have in this whole process is that so much of that wasn't, didn't get to be used in the film. And I think we could do maybe a couple of films with just those interviews, because they were every single one of them was really great. And, um, some of them, we had people come back, like Rory came on one day and we interviewed him for a long time. And then he called me that night and goes, "Hey, I forgot something. I got to come back and tell you another story." So he came back the next day, and that was even more entertaining than the first day. But no, it was all really, really good. And I think everybody there kind of enjoyed being there and being part of this process, and getting to listen to all this stuff. And I liked it.
Yeah. Can I add something to this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
We created this set. We had a really good vibe. And one of the things we asked Patagonia is bring in really good food. So we had really good food brought in, good lunches, because we made it a place to
Really
be.
good.
So a lot of people that came for the interviews, when they were done with the interviews, they wanted to hang around and sit down and listen to the rest. So it created a vibe, like Gerry was saying. But I also want to say something about Gerry. He didn't ask for any control, not one bit. He never once. The only time he ever questioned anything I proposed to him is he would just simply say, "You think that's interesting?" But he never would say why. Like, he just said, "Okay." Everything was okay. He's never once looked at the film and said, "Hey, would you tweak this or that or this?" But I told him at the beginning of the process, because we were friends before this, and I said, "Look, as a filmmaker, I have to be critical towards you, but I don't want you to think that's me personally being critical towards you. So we have to get that understanding right from the get-go. I'm going to have to ask you from time to time critical questions, and I want you to understand that's me, the filmmaker, and not me, the person." So, because I'm a kid who idolized him, and then I got to know him as a filmmaker and accepted into that orbit, and then we share a group of friends because we all learned to kiteboard together. So I have a multiple angled friendship relationship with him.
That makes a lot of sense. And Gerry, I like your suggestion on releasing the extra content. Maybe we can get after premieres, we can get a 20-hour director's cut where we get all those stories too. I'd watch it for sure. But Stacy, most of our listeners, they likely know your work from the seminal Dogtown and Z-Boys that, in part reflected that symbiotic relationship between surfing and skateboarding. But maybe more importantly, it felt like you achieved something really, really difficult, which was to create a project that was celebrated not just by the niche cultures of surfing and skateboarding, but something that also broke through to the mainstream. And in my experience, that is something that rarely happens. You end up either making something that is for the core, which, as we said, is sort of impenetrable to wider audiences, or you water something down for the mainstream, which is then shunned by the core. As a skater and a businessman and a filmmaker, is this a tension that you wrestle with? And is it something that you wrestled with on this particular project?
It's a really, really great question, because it's the one thing that I go into all these projects going, how do I ride this? How do I balance myself on this tightrope? Because it has to get those that are on the edgy part of the culture, but it also can't just get those, because then the film's going to go nowhere. It has to be open to the world. And so how do you do that? You got to make it universal. And one of the ways that I try to do it is through my interviewing process. I don't let people speak in code. In Dogtown, I didn't let people speak in skate code or say ridiculous skate adjectives and things like that, because then people that don't know anything about it are going to watch this and not know what it's about. So, and you try to get you try to bring out the intelligence in everybody, and you try to talk about what the commonality is between all of us, which is that we all want to do something. We all want to express our dreams. We all want to live true to our lives. And if you look at all these films, that's what they're all about. It's about people chasing their dreams and being true to their dreams in the face of odds, in the face of fear, in the face of a lot of difficulties. And so I think that's what they're all about. And I try to make them accessible. That's it. I don't want these things to just be seen by 5 people, you know.
That makes a lot of sense. Gerry, as a lifelong fan, I actually think probably most everyone that started surfing, maybe forever, but 70s, 80s, I started in the 90s, is almost immediately a Gerry Lopez fan by dint of what you've accomplished. But I would say that your life and legacy within the surfing world has been on pretty firm ground now for a long, long time. And this film, in my opinion, cements that even further, but does so by adding some, what I'd consider pretty radical new dimensionality to your story. But I think there's a risk maybe when you set out to do something like that, you don't know how it's going to land. I know you've talked a little bit about this already, but do you ever think of your own legacy and the potential risk that could come to it as a result of any project? And is that ever on your mind when you're kind of going through these kind of projects?
I think the only thing that's on my mind is when I'm going to get my next wave. No, I don't think I think like that. I'm kind of thinking about where I am right here and right now, and what's gonna happen hasn't happened yet, and obviously it will, hopefully. And I don't know, how much control I have over that. And what's already happened is already done. So no, I think I'm pretty firmly in the present. I've never even thought about a legacy. I mean, should I?
well, it is funny, right? Because it does seem like the people who never think about legacy are always the ones that make one, in a way, because they're actually focused on the present. But I love that answer.
Look, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gerry, but Gerry was very aware that his peers were also getting their films. There was the Wayne Lynch film. There was other films about other famous surfers. And Gerry realizes that, he was getting of a certain age, that it might be time to get that done. But just from the time I've spent with him, he knows he's had this incredible past, but he doesn't spend time thinking about it because he's so focused on what he's doing next. He's constantly learning new forms of surfing. And we all have the ability to think past or think future or think now. And from my observation of just watching him, he's aware of it, intimately aware of it. He just doesn't spend time dwelling on it. Because it would take away from what he's doing right now. That's been my observation. Let me add one more thing that's remarkable about this guy. He's in his 70s now, and he's been sponsored. He's been a sponsored surfer his entire life. He has multiple sponsors to this day. How ridiculous is that? He still lives to surf and gets financially paid to surf. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable accomplishment. Every surfer on earth wants that.
It is unbelievable.
It's unbelievable,
but also well earned as well.
Incredible.
And we're going to dive into that. We're going to dive into that in the next segment. We're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. So typically in this part of the podcast, we like to go into the genesis and the biographies of our guests. However, since we're here to talk about your film, Gerry, I think it's better to discuss some of the themes and the elements that both fuel and are fueled by what we see in the movie, because they're really fascinating to me. And so, Gerry, I'll start with you. And I won't spoil anything in the film, but it does start with you apologizing very, very sincerely. And I don't know really of any other biopic that starts with that kind of humility. I think yours might be the first, but it really sets the tone for why this project is so interesting to me, and I think will be interesting to audiences. You really go there in terms of pushing back at how and this is drinking time for our listeners, the surfing industrial complex portrayed you for decades. And I think it's just this awesome example of self-humanizing, and was that something that you focused on when working with Stacy on this film? A kind of, not so much retconning of your life, but maybe just like fleshing out the dimensionality of it?
No, actually, I was really surprised when I saw the first cut. Actually, I don't know if it was in the very first cut, but when I saw that Stacy had used that, because, that was something that we'd kind of been interviewing for a while. And, Stacy said, okay, he exhausted all the questions he had. He goes, do you have anything else you might want to say? And I had been thinking about it, and I went, let me just say this, and I went off on that tangent about stealing everybody's waves. And, I'm not like that anymore, but I guess back then I was. So I don't know.
I really liked it. I thought it was sort of, it encapsulated a lot of what the film was about, which is like shading in these different parts of who Gerry Lopez is. Now, Stacy, you came up in Santa Monica, a member of the original Dogtown skate team and one of the first skateboarders on earth to land, I'm going to use air quotes here for all our listeners, but lucrative endorsement deals. So you're probably one of the few people in history to exist, at least in a sentient way, in the pre and post eras of what would later be dubbed as the action sports industry. And I'd imagine you likely experienced firsthand the disconnect between who you really were and how you were marketed. Can you talk a little bit about your early career as a professional skateboarder and maybe how those experiences later informed your life as a businessman and a filmmaker?
Well, the thing is, I grew up on a team that also had Jay Adams and Tony Alva. And clearly I'm different than those two. Even though we're from the same team, I was different. And I've been asked many years, why is there such a difference? And I finally came to the conclusion that I was I had a job. I've always had a job. Like, my parents were really good to me, but they said, if you want extra things in your life, like surfboards and wetsuits, you got to get a job because we're not making that happen for you. You want a car, you got to make it happen. So literally, I've had a literal job since I was 11 years old. And so when skateboarding came along and somebody told me that they were willing to pay me while I snuck into people's backyards and rode their empty pools, I took that really seriously because I thought, this is the greatest job on planet Earth. I'm getting paid to do something that I would be doing anyways, but they're paying me more than even my parents are making at their professional jobs. So I was a little bit more serious than my peers. And I also realized the frivolity of my professional career, meaning that I knew it had a very limited shelf life. And I started thinking about, I got to do something after this. I don't want to go sell car insurance or something like that, or be a real estate agent. I want to be in skateboarding. And so while I was in my professional career, I started thinking about, I want my own company. I want to be a part of a company. And so I was thinking about that in my professional career. So by the time my professional career was over, I had that all set up. And I attribute that to because I attribute that based on the fact that I was so aware of how unique a position I was in and how I didn't want to blow it. I just didn't want to blow it. I didn't want to get to the age 30 and look in the rearview mirror and go, you blew it. You had a chance. And I was acutely aware, and I don't know why, but I was acutely aware of the possibility of that happening.
Right. And you mentioned, I'm going to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Stacy, just about not being able to completely fit in Hollywood or sort of in the agency world. And a lot of what you do documentary wise, there we go, is really focused on like truism and truth and reflecting as comprehensive an image of reality as possible. Did any of your early experiences as a professional skateboarder like inform that? Did you ever feel like you were marketed as something you weren't? And did that kind of lend itself into how your business sense went when you became a businessman yourself, or even a filmmaker later on?
No, it's not how I was marketed myself, but I'll tell you one thing. When skateboarding blew up in the 70s, there was tremendous pressure from consumer advocates warning parents against the dangers of skateboarding. Um, there was even a guy that would appear on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson holding skateboards saying, "Don't let your kids do this." So what happened was the manufacturers in skateboarding got people like me to become like soldiers of safety so that we would do demos and encourage these kids to wear their helmets and pads and all this stuff. And I bought into it because I could see that like this is something that's needed. But the fact is that skateboarding did not want to go that direction. And so I self-corrected at some point and went, wait a second, we're making a mistake here. We can't cram this down these kids' throat. It's not how they want to do it. And if you look back at the arc of skateboarding, barely anybody even wears pads anymore unless they're doing the most dangerous things. It just isn't how the sport wanted to be. And at some point in the late 70s, early 80s, I came to the realization we have to stop thinking about what we think this sport wants and start listening to what it wants to become and stop projecting what we think upon it. And that was the turning point for me, that right there.
That's really interesting. So, Gerry, there's a moment in the film where the talking heads, they're reflecting on this period of the late 1960s, early 1970s, where you're competing at the U.S. Championships in Huntington Beach, and you're nailing the cover of Surfer Magazine at Ala Moana Bowls. And the talking heads are saying that this was foreshadowing of what was to come. And I was watching it and I'm thinking about it, and I break out my cocktail napkin math, and I'm realizing that you're already in your early 20s at this point. You'd gone to college, you had a job. And I was struck by, these things seem like such a departure from where modern surfing is, in that any mention of foreshadowing seems to happen when a surfer is in their early teens, if that. And I think about this a lot, both in my day job as head of strategy for the WSL and on this podcast. And I have to think that allowing kids to be kids, allowing them to make mistakes, have experiences, become arguably more put together people before the money and the fame comes in, actually benefits everyone, including their sponsors, just in terms of allowing them to be successful and peak in a way, as true adults. And kind of thinking out loud here, I wonder if this trend towards focusing on younger and younger surfers over the last few decades is something that you've noticed and reflected on what that would have done to you had all that pressure been applied to you, 10 years earlier in life.
No, I think, surfing has gone through so many changes as it's evolved into what it is today from when I started surfing. And I think there were a lot of kids, that started a lot younger than me in my time. But I started when I was 10, and that was that. And I wasn't really all that interested at 10 years old in anything, maybe. Um, and it took, a while for surfing to really kind of percolate for me, and for me to, think that I wanted to be in any way serious about it, because it was just stuff, one of the things you did with your friends, and it was pure recreation. But what Stacy just said a little while ago, one of the things about surfing at that period, when he already was, had a job as a skateboarder, the idea that someone would pay anyone to go surfing seemed ludicrous to me. And I mean, for a long time, I never considered the fact that anyone would ever pay me to go surfing. There were a couple guys that were making money from the industry, Corky Carroll, Mike Doyle. They had models with the surfboard companies they were with. And so they were, paid a royalty. David Nueva made a tremendous amount of money off his surfboard models. Stacy was being paid to be a skateboarder long before surfers were being paid to go surfing. And, I think that's maybe a testament to how smart he is, but just the nature of the differences between skateboarding and surfing. And, it really wasn't until like Sean Thompson and Sean and Michael and Peter Townend, Ian Cairns, they started saying that we're going to be professional surfers and people are going to pay us to go surfing. And, I think all the surfers in Hawaii just laughed at them at first, and they were right. And, we were like way wrong, but surfing kept changing all the way along. It was like a chameleon in a way. It just kept changing its colors. And, when I was a youngster, I mean, my parents didn't want me to grow up to be a surfer. I mean, that was not something any parents wanted. Now, you're saying that kids are starting surfing at a lot younger age. Well, I think a lot of that has to do with their parents thinking, well, he could be the next Kelly Slater. And, maybe there are a couple of Kelly Slaters being born right now, but maybe not. I don't know if there's anybody can ever be a Kelly Slater except Kelly.
No, I was just going to kind of add on to what you're saying, because I think it's showcased so beautifully in the film too. Keith Malloy was on the episode a few weeks back, whenever, and he had this comment from when he was younger about the idea of being a professional surfer, and he said, like, look, I can go hammer nails so I can go surfing, or I can go surfing so I can go surfing. He goes, I want to go surfing, so whatever allows me to do that more is the job for me. And it, you kind of developed at that really nascent point in the industry where you became a board builder, and you're like, this is a great job because someone's paying me to build boards, and that means I can surf a lot. And it felt like most people were just kind of forming the industry out of that desire to think, okay, what's going to allow me to surf more?
Well, exactly how it happened. And I mean, we had, Jack Shipley and I had our surf shop pretty much so we could go surfing when we wanted to. When the waves were good. But I think everybody that was working in the industry, which wasn't really much of an industry back then, did it because what they really wanted to do was go surfing. And anything that had to do with the business of surfing, it was kind of understood by the customers of that business, whatever it was, that if the waves were good, they might have to wait a little bit longer for whatever it was they were buying or getting. And that's kind of how it worked. And it was a beautiful thing.
Let me add to this, if I can.
Yes, please.
It's true what Gerry said about Mike Doyle and Corky Carroll and David Nuuva. That was kind of like at the end of the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. By the 70s, by the time this movie, the era upon which this movie is, in, the three most famous surfers in the world are Gerry Lopez, Barry Kanaipuni, and Jeff Hackman. Okay, with Reno Abellero right next to them. Those are the most famous surfers in the world. Of those three, Jeff Hackman's the only one that made any money. He made probably 10 grand one year, I think, from endorsements and contest winnings. The second two, Gerry and Barry, they had to make their living being shapers. There was that little organized surfing back then. The other thing I wanted to say is Tony Alva, Jay Adams, and myself, we were competitive surfers. We wanted to be professional surfers. That was where we were going. We didn't even consider ourselves skateboarders. That was just something that we did to supplement our surfing. But, of course, the urethane wheel was invented, and the board we were riding didn't have fins. It had wheels, which was going to take us to our future. We just didn't know it.
Totally. And I love this part in both films, the Dogtown film and the Gerry film, Stacy, where it's just so deftly put together, like illustrating where capitalism and commerce collide with subculture and something really special, and they feel almost note for note, when you compare the two, retelling of what happened in Dogtown and Z-Boys around the same time, unless I'm mistaken. But did you see, as a filmmaker, like a lot of similarities when you were chronicling, like, okay, the industry's picking up, this is what's happening to these figures, whether they were skaters and surfers or whether they were industry folks, as the industry matured and there was a lot of teething happening? Did you see a lot of similarities in how you told both segments in both stories? And if so, what were they? And if you had any differences, what would those have been as well?
Well, if you look at these sports, they all evolve the same way. It's all the same acts: Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. If you look at the, the acts of each surf clothing company, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, they almost do the same thing, everybody. Human nature is very predictable. And so the arc of skateboard and the arc of surfing, as far as organized skateboarding and organized surfing, has been very, very similar. Suddenly money comes in, sponsorship comes in, more shops open up, more need for product, more opportunities for people to be paid, bigger contests, bigger sponsorships. It's an evolution, but they all do the same thing for the most part. And skateboarding was modeled off of surfing. We had a magazine, Skateboarder magazine, that was a stepchild of Surfer, run by the same company. We had a lot of skateboard manufacturers that began as surf manufacturers, Gordon and Smith, Larry Gordon. So there was a connection to each sport and how they evolved because it was the same people in many situations. And because we're cross-fertilizing, even though I was skateboarding, I was still aware of what Gerry was doing and going to surf films and surfing myself. So this cross-pollination was happening. We weren't paying attention to bicycle motocross. We were looking at surfing and skateboarding.
Right. That's interesting. Like they were almost using the same playbook as they built both of these industrial cultures.
If you look at all the skateboard videos that I made in the 80s, they're all just takeoffs of surf films. It's like I learned at the feet of Hal Jepsen and Greg McGilvery and Scott Dietrich. And so when it was my time to start making skate videos, I just did the same thing that I grew up seeing. I wasn't aware I was doing it, but now that I look back, I went, oh, I see. I was just following what I had grown up seeing at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium.
That makes sense. Gerry, Stacy mentioned how expansive your story is. There's so many different dimensions and so many different places, but two of the real focal settings in the film are Hawaii, both the South Shore with your upbringing and the North Shore where you became a legend, and then Indonesia, both the island of Bali, particularly Uluwatu, and then the mythical Garajagan. And this sequence in the film is just so arresting and beautiful, and everyone should see it. Having had the privilege to go to G-Land this year for the CT event, one thing that I experienced on a much smaller scale, but really resonated when I watched the film, is the idea that you can go somewhere and eliminate these distractions and be very, very present. And by doing that, how much deeper that makes everything feel. I would imagine that at that point in your life, your study of yoga, not just the physical, but the mental and the spiritual, had really primed you for this kind of experience. Can you talk to us a little bit about both your life with yoga and how that influenced your time in Garageagon?
Well, I mean, it kind of all started with the endless summer. The whole idea of you don't have to just surf in front of your house or, where you live or where you usually go surfing near your home, that you can travel and go surfing. And, when we first went to Bali, and we had no idea we had some idea. We knew that there was good waves there, but we had no idea how much that would affect our personal lives. And Jack McCoy had gone the year before, and he told Jeff Hackman and I, the first time, and Jeff was kind of a tough sell. I don't know if I want to go there or not. And he ended up going, and Indonesia really became a big part of all our lives from that point forward, because not only the surf was real consistent and really good and the kind of waves we really liked, but the lifestyle was I guess, I know we talked about it at one point and thought in those early days in Bali, this must have been what Hawaii was like 100 years ago. And, here we are, we got modern surfboards and there's nobody here. And, this is about as good as it gets. And it just opened up a whole world of, okay, you can surf so many hours in the day, which ended up being most of the hours of the day. But then you have to, really kind of get organized about the rest of the hours, and yoga had been a big part of my lifestyle already. And really my entire surfing lifestyle was really based on the yoga lifestyle, which, obviously the first thing is proper exercise. And, the other parts of that was proper breathing, which we did a lot of anyway, a lot of heavy breathing, in the waves, proper relaxation, proper diet, and positive thinking. And that was something that really seemed to fit well with the lack of distractions that we found in Indonesia that didn't get in the way of our surfing like they did at home. I wasn't building surfboards in Indo, so I didn't have to think about that part of my life. All I was thinking about was going surfing and doing everything that I could to be able to do that in the most efficient and effective way possible. And it really just kind of happened on its own like that. And worked out really good.
A lot of people really talk about that sequence, the Indonesian sequence in the film. And when we cut the sequence, I didn't want any outside voices making comments upon it. You know what I'm saying? I didn't want to have Michael Thompson or Sean Thompson or Randy Rarick talking about the bigger picture. I just wanted it to be Gerry's thing. But Michael Thompson did have a really, really astute soundbite that I did want to use, but if you're not going to use outside voices, you can't. So I had to leave it. But he said, he goes, Gerry's trips to Indonesia and G-Land specifically were so profound at that time in surfing that he himself, his life himself, became a brand of what surfers wanted to become, because he was going there every single year. It was extremely rugged. It was extremely dangerous. You had to pre-plan everything like a military, but he was living the life that every surfer ultimately dreams of, which is to find nirvana in the surf that's away from everything else. And Michael just summed it up in this beautiful soundbite that I would have liked to have used, but again, it would have changed the tenor and the tone of that sequence. But I've never forgotten that, how he said that just Gerry's example of how he lived his life became such a touchstone for future generations based on that experience.
That's really interesting. It's something I had seen the film before we went out there this year and then watched it again recently. And it was something that was on my mind a lot out there. And obviously a lot's changed. There's camps and internet and iPhones and all sorts of stuff. But a question for both of you, obviously things have changed a lot where it's become very, very difficult to find that space and that place to disconnect and to not be distracted. Do you think it's impossible in 2022? And if not, how do you both seek it out? Just having clear space to be present in a way. Gerry, I'll start with you.
You don't want to let Stacy go first?
Well, look at that. Okay, demure. Stacy, you go.
It is possible to find it. It's possible to find it because ultimately exists within all of us, inside all of us. And so what I do is I meditate at least for 1 hour every day. I try to hit 2 hours. I don't always succeed at that, but my meditation practice is the most important part of my life. For that very reason, to find that place of stillness, of quiet,
right,
and to dissolve. It's every time you meditate, it's like peeling in the onion of your ego. You're getting rid of more and more and more and more of your ego. It's a very slow process. It's a very long process, but it's a very important process. At least for me, it is.
Life is moment to moment. I mean, it's one moment after another. They're all connected. And all we can really do is try to have the intention to live each moment to its fullest. And, sometimes we're very successful at it some days, and other days we're not. But it's like that, every day the sun comes up and you start a new day and you get to do maybe what you didn't get to do the day before, or at least think about it. And, what Stacy says is so very true, that all these moments all exist within us, and our whole, I think it's more of a Western mentality, is so external that it makes it difficult for us, to look inward, to be inward in our thinking. And this is something that we have to learn to do, because there's really a lot of good stuff in there that it's just waiting to be discovered. And there's still, I think, every surfer, if he really takes a good look, realizes and understands there's still those beautiful moments. Maybe they're not, 6 weeks long, 24/7, like they used to be in those early days in G-Land. But there are times, where it is as beautiful as it ever was. And we just have to savor those moments when we experience them, and realize that, wow, okay, this is as good as it gets, man. Oh, now that's over. Okay, now I got to go back to the grind. But I think the reassuring thing is that there's another one of those moments up ahead, and eventually we're going to get to it.
Yeah, I just to add to what Gerry's saying, um, he and I have a similarity in that, Gerry's done every form of surfing, longboard surfing, shortboard surfing, tube riding, windsurfing, kiteboarding. And now he's into all the forms of foil surfing and SUP, the whole thing. I've done a lot of these things myself and continue, but in regards to what we're speaking of, my goal someday, and I'm starting to work on it now, is to learn to go out and ride the worst surf, including just whitewater, and having that be enough. The one thing I don't like about surfing is I don't like the fact that I need it to be good. That bothers me. And I want to learn how to I want to learn how to enjoy surfing if I even only get whitewater. I really do. To me, that's enlightenment.
I think that's beautifully said by both of you. We're going to take one more quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. Stacy, while you mentioned that you probably square pegged into Hollywood, you're certainly no stranger to it, having grown up in Los Angeles, but neither was Gerry. Gerry ended up developing a relationship with Apocalypse Now's John Milius, who later brought him in on Big Wednesday, Conan the Barbarian, and so on. This part of Gerry's life, it's featured in the film, but I'm curious if you, as a filmmaker, noticed, an elevated sense of comfort with Gerry when he was in front of the camera working on the project.
I don't think Gerry's Hollywood experience has anything to do with his comfort in front of the camera. I think Gerry's been photographed his whole life so often and for so many decades that he just simply understands how to do it. He's been interviewed so many times that he understands how to do it. And so he has a natural comfort. He just knows. I've even watched him. I was on a surf trip with him a number of years back, and there was a very famous photographer, Dana Edmonds, that was with us. And Dana would go out and shoot Gerry, and just the way Gerry worked with Dana, even walking along the beach, he just understands what he needs to do. He does it, doesn't make a big deal about it, but he understands it. It's part of his business, it's part of his responsibility, and it's his life. And so he learned early on that the camera is part of his life. And it's an important part of his life because it's how he makes his living. And he has to understand it and be good to it in return because the camera's been very good to him. All of us that made our living off of surfing or skateboarding had to at some point understand this process. Even Jay Adams he understood the camera like Marilyn Monroe. Seriously. And so it's just something that comes with the terrain. Some guys get it, some guys don't. And those who do have longer careers.
Life's a stage kind of thing. Gerry, you've got this great line in the film where you're talking about living in Los Angeles and pursuing acting, frankly, as a lot of surfers, whether it was Duke Kahanamoku or Peter Townend, they've done in the past. But you're talking about, or at least implying, partying in Hollywood, and you say, I was old enough to know better, but dumb enough to still do it. And that really resonated with me. It's like anytime I'm like come back from a night out and I don't feel great, I'm like, you know what? This is like the exact way I feel. But, for all your success in life, whether it's within surfing or in yoga, it still seems like you, as we all did, we still all have to kind of learn some lessons the hard way. Can you talk to us a little bit about, getting, in a way, kind of just getting stuck in the LA rabbit hole for a period of time?
Well, I think, we all get caught up in belief systems that we believe we have to have these things, we have to do these things. And that's part of the process of, learning about yourself that, whatever it takes at some point when you don't get to have these things or do these things, what happens to you? And I guess really the answer is really nothing happens to you. And so why do you have to have them or, think you need them? And it's a funny thing that, I mean, we're all a victim of that and we all get sucked into that. And it's, I guess it's not what we really think it is. And, I've had a lot of friends that have had issues with, for instance, substance abuse. And, they had such a great campaign for a long time that said, just say no. And, on one hand, it is so simple and easy. But then, of course, on the other hand, for some people, it isn't. But the reality is, it is easy. And that's one of the great lessons in life is that, some of the most difficult answers are actually really simple. And it just, I guess, takes time, and in my yoga practice, all the way along, just with my friends, and later on with instructing, I've come to realize that yoga, like surfing, in fact, they may be exactly the same path. It happens differently for every person. And usually the way it happens is that it has to happen at the right time for that person. And if it's not the right time, it's not going to happen. And there's not really anything you can do about that except wait for the right time. And that's just the way it is. Some things just don't happen like you think they're going to happen. My son, for example, I took him surfing when he was 8 months old, and I thought, oh man, he's going to be a surfer. But then he wasn't that interested. And, we moved up here to Bend, Oregon to be, I don't know. At first, I think the beginning was just because we liked snowboarding so much. And, he was still very young, so he wasn't that interested yet. But eventually he did get interested and he became, a really top level snowboarder. I mean, a professional. And he wasn't interested in surfing for a long time. And then, I didn't think surfing was something you wanted to ever pressure anyone into doing. And I saw that happen a lot with young kids that, had a bad experience and then they never wanted to do it again. And I didn't want that to happen for him, but he was getting older, and he still wasn't interested. And, I mean, he was interested on a very superficial level, it's a recreational thing, but he wasn't interested in getting serious about it. And I never pushed that. And Stacy was there in the beginning when we went to this place in Mexico that some friends of ours have. It's kind of like a surf resort. It's called Cardona, really great spot and a great wave that I thought, okay, if he's going to get interested in surfing, this is the wave that's going to do it for him. And at first it didn't, but eventually it did. And it was a process that had to happen in its own time, in its own space for him. And it really made me realize that that's kind of the way everything in life is supposed to be. You just, if it's not the right time, it's not the right time. And when it is the right time. And then it's great.
I love that story. I think it was great. Stacy, I'll bring this conversation back a little bit full circle for the moment, and again, just praise your ability to, in my opinion, radically further dimensionalize one of the key figures in surfing history. And I think, in my experience, surfing, which in a way isn't much different to the way it works in politics or other sports or the entertainment industry, it has this weirdly insecure motivation to whitewash, its heroes and figures, to kind of like distill them down to these non-complex concepts of good and bad. And I think this kind of simplicity, it makes the digestion of these stories very easy, but in the medium and the long term probably does us all like a big disservice, And I watched the film again, and it showcases Gerry, as both peaceful wave savant and aggressive lineup heavy, and as both yoga student and teacher and, fallible human being. And that doesn't detract from the impression that I had of him before, but it really elevates it to new heights because, I think of everything he was able to do, everything he was able to accomplish. And at the same time, I understand that he was very human the whole time. And that to me is so much more inspiring. And I think you should receive a lot of credit for, I really, really enjoyed the yin and yang in Gerry Lopez. And I think all of our listeners are going to enjoy watching it too.
Well, the thing is, I will say this, I'll add this to it. And this goes back to that comment when I said to Gerry at the beginning, I have to have the right to be critical to you without you taking it personally from me. Because in order for people to understand him, they have to know the mistakes he's made in the past and how he corrected those mistakes, because that's how people live through these films. They want to know what Gerry did. So when he told me that he had partied a lot and did a lot of, substance on the set of Big Wednesday, I went, oh, that's a moment. And then when he said to me, he realized what a mistake that was and went, great, we have to hit that, because that's the point where the audience can go, I've been affected by that before. There was the other part about, the lightning bolt thing and where it tilted, commercially, and Gerry had to self-correct there. And those are the moments where the audience can come in and go, oh, he's human. He's like me. We show him learning to foil. And I don't think anybody's ever seen Gerry look like America's Funniest Home Videos learning something, but they get to see that in this film. And what it does is it makes his great surfing at Pipeline and at G-Land even more deep, because we realize maybe it doesn't come so easy to this guy. Maybe he's more like me than I think. So that's, as a filmmaker, that's what I had to search for in him, because he's a magician, man, and you got to watch very carefully. Once in a while you can see the dice, but rarely. And so I had to pay close attention to just watching him and finding out, where can I see that thingy, because he does it so effortlessly, but it's not effortless.
That's awesome. Well, guys, we reached out to our Instagram community at the Lineup Pod for questions for both of you, and we're inundated. We got a lot, but we whittled it down to one each. So the first question, Gerry, is for you. It's from @Voe_the Instafluencer, who asks, Gerry, what is your most memorable time living at the original Pipe House?
I don't know. When I had to fix all the stuff that broke, when I realized that it was a sinking ship, that living on the beach wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And no, I guess it was, when I got injured and I was got speared in the butt by my board, and I couldn't go surfing. I remember sitting there watching all the guys surfing and thinking, just being a spectator of surfing is almost as good as actually doing it. Not quite, but almost. And it really made me understand the attraction of surfing to people that don't do it. That it's pretty cool, that you can just sit there and get drawn in and spend all day watching it. I mean, watching waves is kind of like watching a fireplace. That's something that's pretty interesting too. But watching people surfing those waves is even more so. And that was something I learned at the Pipeline House that I didn't know before. And it's always made a strong impression on me.
That's a great answer. The second question, Stacy, is for you. It's from @IamMatson, who asks, Stacy, what documentary have you always wanted to make that you haven't made yet?
I'd like to make a documentary on marriage. Okay, we're brought up in America to view marriage as a fantasy. It's like, oh, you met the perfect person. Your life's going to be great from this point forward. When in fact, it's exactly the opposite. You've decided to go into this agreement with this person where you're going to grow together for the next 30, 40, 50 years. It's going to be the most difficult thing you ever do in your life. But no one ever talks about that. We're led to believe it's a fantasy, but in fact, it's the most important thing that we're ever going to do in our life and the hardest thing we're ever going to do in our life. But no one shares that with us. And you don't find out until you're in it. And then you think, I must be failing at this because no one's ever talked about this before. But then you start talking to people and you realize, wait a minute, everyone feels this way. This is really difficult. Well, maybe if we knew more about this institution, we'd be better at doing it. We'd understand it better, and we would know how to walk through it better. Now, I don't think I'm going to make this film, but I would like to. And I don't think I'm going to because I don't think I'm ever going to get financing for it. So I don't think it's going to happen, but that's the one I'd like to make.
That's a great answer. And I like what you said too, right? Because sometimes, whether it's marriage or anything, particularly in Western society or America in particular, like sometimes things are hard. But when they're presented as you said, this fantasy that's perfect, when they're bad, you're like, man, I'm not even middle of the road. Like I'm doing this really wrong. But as you said, the more people you talk to, whether it's about marriage or anything else, you're like, this is the standard. Why don't we just talk about this up front so we don't have these false expectations? I think it's a great thing.
Well, also, if you
who knows? Maybe we'll get financing for it.
If you look at Hollywood films, if you look at the great relationship films in Hollywood, the film ends all the time when they finally get together. They've been fighting the whole time and they finally fall in love and they walk away. But it's like we never get to see them live it. We only get to see the lead up to it. And that's another part of the fantasy. The other thing, too, is when two people are together, one of them is always up and one of them is always down. I don't mean depressed down, but you're rarely in the same place. And so getting used to that dynamic between each other is really difficult. So there's a tremendous amount of material to mine there, but it's one of those things.
It's called yin and yang.
Yeah,
there you
yin
go.
and yang.
We've got the title for it. Surely someone will finance it now. Well, I appreciate both those answers. They were great, and I appreciate everyone that wrote in questions at the lineup pod. We're now down to our final segment. This is the lightning round. So this is the lightning round presented by BF Goodrich. So these are going to be 10 questions for both of you to answer as quickly as you can. For organizational purposes, maybe I'll ask the question, Stacy, you answer, Gerry, you answer, then I'll ask the next question. First question. If you could only have one board setup for the rest of your life, a single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad, bonzer, or finless, which would you choose?
Thruster.
Single fin.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Tea.
Burrito or pizza?
Burrito.
Burrito.
Last book you read?
What's it called? Leave the gun, grab the cannoli.
What was the question?
Last book you read?
Oh. How to Change Your Mind?
One wave you never have to go back to?
That's a really tough question. That can't be in a fast round.
That's okay. I feel like it might actually run counter to your philosophy on wanting to be completely content just riding whitewater. So that's totally fine. You say, you know what? I'm
But
happy
that's
to
the
go
case.
back.
I can't come up with a bad spot.
That's totally fine.
Yeah.
Gerry, I'll pass that one over to you.
Jaws.
There you go. If you only get to surf one wave break for the rest of your life?
Waikiki.
Restaurants.
Best person to share a lineup with?
Who's ever there?
Friends.
Worst person to share a lineup with?
That would require. I'd have to mention a specific culture, and I won't do that.
Fair enough.
Oh, I don't know.
That's okay. People usually demur on this one. Last one for both of you. Finish this sentence, please. I will next achieve a state of happiness by...
Meditating.
Standing on my head.
Wonderful. Stacy Peralta, Gerry Lopez, it's been a true honor. This conversation over-delivered in ways I couldn't have ever dreamed of. So I really appreciate it. I want everyone to make sure you check out The Yin and Yang of Gerry Lopez, which will premiere online on September 22nd at patagonia.com/Gerry. And guys, thank you once again. I had a really good time.
Thanks, Dave.
You're welcome. Thank you.
See you, Gerry. See you in LA soon.